Okay, so in the last video we were talking about how to make sense out of like big, complex, abstract ideas, right? So if you've ever come across like, something difficult you read, or like, maybe you were sitting in on a lecture or something and were really unsure what was going on, and someone said, hey, so what was that about? And you're like, man, I don't know. Like, I don't even know how to begin asking questions. I'm so confused, right? And indeed, I'm not trying to scare you, but you may, have that experience in this class where you'll read a passage and you will have like no ability to even connect it to something. And this happens all the time. And so then I'll say to students, well, what are your questions? And they're like, I don't understand it. So if you're going to say, okay, so suppose this is our passage, right? So this thought cloud is just nothing but your confusions. And your response is, I don't get it. Which is, entirely legitimate, right? But do understand something. This right here is an emotional response. Because the thing is this. When you're first confronted with something bigger than your ability to know, or else something abstract and unfamiliar, the thing is, your brain has to chop it into pieces. It's just like a steak, right? Like, if you're going to eat a steak, you don't just wolf down the whole thing whole like pythons do or something, right? You have to cut it into pieces with your knife, and then you chew it into smaller pieces, and it is like broken down until you get what your body gets what it can out of it. It's the same thing with ideas. So when we start with the big gray cloud of, oh my God, I don't get it. The first thing we have to do is we've got to break this sucker down into specific issues that we don't get, right? Because if you say, whatever, let's say we're reading, Aristotle's Categories. And that's not an easy read, there's no question. But if after you read the first, chapter of the Categories, you're like, oh man, I just don't get any of it. That doesn't help you, and it doesn't help me, it doesn't help anybody. But if you can say, I don't understand what this means on line 307A, bam, now we can start getting somewhere, right? Because there is where we can start, putting our crowbar and trying to pry this thing apart so we can begin to understand. Now check this out. Rene Descartes. Oh no, that's not what I wanted. But here's what I wanted. So Rene Descartes, who was a modern philosopher, among other things, wrote a book called The Discourse on Method of Rightly Conducting Reason and Seeking Truth in the Sciences. And here, just note my HTML or URL. This is from the Gutenberg project. And what they're doing is and you might know Gutenberg is the guy that invented the printing press, right? There's all kinds, hundreds and hundreds of classical, literary and philosophical works that they convert into HTMLs. The drawback is, though, if you look here, it doesn't tell you the translator, right? This was written in French, and oh well, for us it's okay. But anyway. So first of all, notice, in terms of breaking down our reading, your language already helps you, right? Because first, you get titles of things. And the title gives you a window into what you're going to be reading, right? So this is a discourse. In other words, what? It's someone giving their opinions on the method of rightly conducting the reason and seeking truth in sciences. So this is going to be how to think properly. And then, of course, you have the various parts. And if you're looking at a table of contents or an actual book, to me, I'm kind of old school. I like actual books. But nevertheless, this gives you a sense of where we're going. And then, you have your parts. And notice each part then is broken into paragraphs. And each paragraph is broken into sentences, right? So my point is, instead of saying, oh, I don't understand it, you can say, I don't understand part 1, sentence 2. You know what I mean? And that's where we begin to pull things down. This is a really interesting read. It talks about how the guy was very educated, and the nature of the various disciplines that he understood. But remember, he's looking for truth in the sciences. And he's writing at a time in which medieval science is giving way to modern science. And you all have heard of alchemy and all that kind of stuff, right? I'm scrolling down, by the way, to get to the particular section I want to look at here. And in the medieval period, in the Renaissance, there was still like science and magic were very kind of intertwined, right? And people understood scientific facts mainly by authority, either the authority of, a living person, oftentimes a religious guy, or the authority of ancient books that they had found. And so, really, you would not be able to distinguish science from magic in those days. But what Descartes is after, and what the modern world is after, excuse me, is something certain. So we're not going to try to turn lead into gold with magic and the purity of our souls. Instead, we're going to try to figure out what we can actually know with certainty. Now, right here in this little section, in part 2 of the Discourse on Method, he breaks understanding things into 4 little rules that I think are really worth our time to look at. Look what he says. Among the branches of philosophy, I had at an earlier period given some attention to logic, and among those of math, to geometrical analysis and algebra. The 3 arts or sciences which ought, as conceived, to contribute something to my design. He's looking for certainty, so notice he's looking at logic, math, algebra. That's significant. But on examination, I found that as for logic, its syllogisms and the majority of its other precepts are of avail rather in the communication of what we already know. Or in the art of Lully, in speaking without judgment of things of which we are ignorant, in the investigation of the unknown. So in other words, what does logic do? Logic helps us to understand what we already know and create correct arguments. But logic is not going to help us understand new things. And although this science contains indeed a number of correct and excellent precepts, there are nevertheless so many others, and these either injurious or superfluous, mingled with the former, that it's almost quite as difficult to effect a severance of the true from the false as it is to extract a Diana or a Minerva from a rough block of marble. In other words, what's he saying? Logic is more art than science. Diana or Minerva from a block of marble. In other words, sculpting, right? So to pull a quote-unquote truth out of something, what he's saying with logic and stuff, is almost like being a sculptor, right? In other words, it's in the hands of the individual. He's looking for a truth that is not in the hands of an individual. So as the analysis of the ancients and the algebra of the moderns, besides that they embrace only matters highly abstract and to appearance of no use, the former is so exclusively restricted to the consideration of figures that it can exercise the understanding only on condition of greatly fatiguing the imagination. So in other words, it's like so complex that it's almost useless. And in the latter, there is so complete a subjection to certain rules and formulas that there results an art full of confusion and obscurity calculated to embarrass, instead of a science fitted to cultivate the mind. So again, too many rules. So every time, we're trying to figure something out, there's this rule, that rule, to the point where it's so dizzying, you can't really apply it. By these considerations, I was induced to seek some other method, which would comprise the advantages of the 3 and be exempt from their defects. Right? So in other words, he's looking for a new way to understand things without all this confusion and without all this, need for complex rules. By these considerations, I was induced to seek some, I just read that. And as a multitude of laws often only hampers justice, so that a state is best governed when, with few laws, these are rigidly administered, in like manner, instead of a great number of precepts of which logic is composed, I believed that the 4 following would prove perfectly sufficient for me. provided I took the firm and unwavering resolution never in a single instance to fail in observing them. Now notice, as I read this, vocabulary may be an issue, right? Notice the sentences are long. That's not his fault. We have been conditioned not to think in complex sentences anymore. But notice how I followed the commas and punctuation and stuff. And I hope you were able to understand, sort of pay attention to the rhythm of my reading, because the punctuation and grammar itself helps us to slow down and emphasize so that we begin to pick out the things that really help us understand. But anyways, here's the 4 rules. Ready? 1, the first, never to accept anything for true that I did not clearly know to be such, and avoid precipitancy and prejudice, and compare nothing more in my judgment than was presented to my mind so clearly and distinctly as to exclude all ground of doubt. In other words, what? If you want to understand something, first, don't accept anything unless you know for sure. So let's go back to our little picture. In other words, so here's, my big cloud of, oh my gosh, I don't understand. Well, one thing I could do is I could start going to SparkNotes, right? And if I go to SparkNotes or any other kind of, internet summary, then I've broken rule number 1. Because if I don't understand this, how do I know that SparkNotes is accurately portraying this, right? So if I go to a source other than what I understand, then I'm doing exactly what he said not to do. I am accepting as true something I don't know to be true. So let's not go to outside help. Let's not go to someone else who's going to digest it for us. We need to do it ourselves. Okay? So that's rule number 1. Otherwise, we're going to be prejudicial. In other words, we'll say, oh yeah, I read this in SparkNotes, therefore it's true. That's not the case. The second, divide each of the difficulties under examination into as many parts as possible as might be necessary for adequate solution. So in other words, that is the process of breaking this sucker into pieces, right? And when it comes to reading stuff, as I was telling you, the best way to break it into pieces is parts, paragraphs, sentences. And a lot of things we read will have line numbers, which makes it even easier. So we break it into pieces. So instead of, I don't get it, we say, I don't get this. And now, if you don't get that, I can zero in on that and I can tell you, oh yeah, well, this is what he means. That's what that word means. And then we can begin to understand. Third, to conduct my thoughts in such order that by commencing with objects the simplest and easiest to know, I might ascend little by little, and as it were, step by step, to the knowledge of the more complex. Right? So in other words, what is he saying there? So then what we do is we start with simple things. So we begin to understand each of these pieces. And then as we understand each of the pieces, then we can put them back until we understand the complex whole. And last, in every case, make enumeration so complete and review so general that it might be assured that nothing was omitted. So then at the end, you come back and review, right? In our case, what that would be is you go back and read your notes, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to break things down into their pieces, right? By, section numbers, whatever, sentences. Then we're going to understand each little sentence, right? Boop, boop, until we can understand the paragraph. And then we can understand the section. And then we go back and we put all those little pieces together as we review the reading so that we come to understand the whole, and that's how you do it. It's just like digestion. You break it down, you build it back up. That's the deal. So, Descartes, Discourse on Method, excellent advice here. I would also, highly advise you to read as much of this as you can. Obviously, in an intro class like this, we're not going to be able to assign everything, right? However, the point of a class like this is to expose you to stuff, right? That you, and recommend things for your own reading that you will then internalize and read on your own. This is a great one. Talk to you later.